Picture this, 1932 Australia. The Great Depression is in full swing, farmers are struggling. And to make matters worse, thousands upon thousands of emus are on the move, heading straight for their crops. These weren't your average birds. These were emus, big flightless birds with a knack for destroying fences and devouring wheat. The stage was set for a showdown unlike any other, the Great Emu War. Now I know what you're thinking. A war against birds? It sounds ridiculous, right? And you wouldn't be wrong. But for the farmers of Western Australia, it was a desperate situation. Their livelihoods were at stake. They'd tried everything to stop the emus' fences, guns even hurting them, but nothing worked. These birds were persistent. The emus just kept coming like a feathered army with an appetite for destruction. They were like the Genghis Khan of the bird world, only less interested in conquering land and more interested in gobbling up every last grain of wheat in sight. The farmers finally threw up their hands and appealed to the government for help. And the government, bless their souls, decided to send in the big guns, literally. The emus, for their part, were completely oblivious to the impending conflict. They didn't care about politics or economics. They were driven by one thing: survival. And in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Australian outback, survival meant finding food and water wherever it could be found. Unfortunately for the farmers, the emus had developed a taste for wheat, and not just a nibble here and there. We're talking about a full-blown, all-you-can-eat wheat buffet. They descended upon the fields in droves, their powerful legs carrying them across the countryside with surprising speed. The farmers watched in dismay as their crops vanished before their very eyes. Their fences, meant to keep out rabbits and other pests, were useless against the emus' powerful legs. It was like trying to stop a tank with a picket fence. The emus just strolled through, leaving a trail of flattened crops and frustrated farmers in their wake. Word of the emu invasion reached the Australian government and they faced a dilemma. On one hand, it was just a bunch of birds. On the other hand, these birds were causing widespread agricultural damage and threatening the livelihoods of their constituents. What to do? After much debate, and I imagine quite a few chuckles, the government decided to take drastic action. They would send in the army. Yes, you read that right. The Australian army was called upon to fight emus. Armed with Lewis guns, serious military firepower, the soldiers were dispatched to Western Australia with orders to deal with the emu menace. The media had a field day, dubbing it the Great Emu War. Newspapers ran headlines like "Feathered Fiends Terrorize Farmers" and "Government Declares War on Emus." It was an international sensation, with everyone eager to see how this bizarre battle would unfold. The first battle of the Great Emu War took place in November of 1932. The soldiers, confident in their superior firepower, set out to engage the enemy. They spotted a large flock of emus gathered in a field and opened fire. Now you might expect a scene of carnage, with birds dropping from the sky like feathered rain, but that's not quite what happened. See, emus are surprisingly tough, and fast, and smart. As soon as the shooting started, the emus scattered in all directions. They were like feathered ninjas, dodging bullets and disappearing into the bush. The soldiers, taken aback by the emus' agility and resilience, found themselves firing at fleeting shadows. Their machine guns, designed for warfare against human soldiers, were proving utterly useless against these feathered foes. The first battle ended in a resounding victory for the emus. The soldiers, somewhat bewildered and more than a little embarrassed, retreated to regroup and rethink their strategy. The soldiers quickly realized they had underestimated their avian adversaries. These weren't just some dim-witted chickens. Emus were masters of guerrilla warfare. They were experts at blending into the landscape, using their speed and knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The soldiers tried everything. They chased the emus, they set up ambushes. They even tried mounting a Lewis gun on the back of a truck, hoping to outmaneuver the birds. But the emus always seemed to be one step ahead, disappearing into the bush or simply outrunning their pursuers. It was like trying to catch smoke. The soldiers, growing increasingly frustrated, began to suspect that the emus were toying with them. These were no ordinary birds. They were tactical geniuses, feathered Napoleons waging a war of attrition against their human foes. Section 6. Retreat. The emus prevail. After weeks of embarrassing defeats, the Australian government decided to call off the Great Emu War. The soldiers, relieved to be free from their feathered foes, packed up their Lewis guns and returned home, thoroughly outmaneuvered and outwitted. The emus, victorious, continued their march across the countryside, feasting on wheat and leaving a trail of bewildered farmers in their wake. They had successfully defended their territory and their right to graze wherever they pleased. The Great Emu War was a humbling defeat for the Australian army. They had gone to war with emus and lost. The birds, it seemed, had won the day. Section 7, Lessons Learned, sort of. The Great Emu War, despite its comical nature, taught us some valuable lessons. Firstly, never underestimate the enemy, no matter how small or feathery they may seem. Emus, it turns out, are incredibly resilient and resourceful creatures. Secondly, sometimes the best-laid plans, even those involving military firepower, can be foiled by a bunch of birds with a good appetite and a knack for evasion. And finally, the Great Emu War highlighted the importance of understanding the natural world and the creatures we share it with. Emus, while a nuisance to farmers, play an important role in the Australian ecosystem. Section 8. The Emus' Victory March Through History. The Great Emu War may have been a military defeat, but it was a public relations triumph for the emus. They became unlikely folk heroes, symbols of Aussie resilience, and a reminder that even the most powerful forces can be humbled by nature. The story of the war captured the world's imagination, becoming a legendary tale of man versus bird. It became a popular topic for newspaper articles, cartoons, and even songs. The emus, once seen as pests, were now celebrated for their cunning and their ability to outsmart the mighty Australian army. The Great Emu War became a beloved part of Australian folklore, a humorous reminder of the country's unique wildlife and the challenges of coexisting with nature. Section 9. A salute to the victors. So, the next time you see an emu, take a moment to appreciate these remarkable birds. They're survivors, they're warriors, they're the victors of the Great Emu War. And they're a hilarious reminder that sometimes nature has a way of putting us in our place. The Great Emu War may be long over, but the legend lives on. And the emus? Well, they're still out there roaming the Australian outback, a feathery testament to the unpredictable and often hilarious nature of life itself.